Welcome to the Truth in Crime Case Files. On June 21, 2015, it was a warm Sunday afternoon in the quiet neighborhood of Willow Glen, where the narrow tree-lined streets were dotted with modest, well-kept houses. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows as children played in their yards and neighbors exchanged pleasantries. Among them was Janine Rue, a woman in her late 40s with a sharp eye for detail. She had lived next door to Maureen Delacroix for nearly 2 decades, and in all that time, Maureen's routine had become as familiar as her own. Maureen was the kind of woman who kept to herself but was always polite in passing. At 68, she still took pride in tending her garden and could often be seen watering her roses or sitting on her porch with a cup of tea and a novel. But over the last few days, Janine had noticed something odd. Maureen hadn't been outside at all. There had been no sign of her usual evening walks, no porch lights in the evening, and most concerning of all, an acrid, pungent smell had started to drift from the house. At first, Janine brushed it off as nothing, but as the odor grew more intense, she felt a growing sense of unease. On this particular Sunday, as the smell became unbearable, she decided she couldn't ignore it any longer. Something wasn't right. With her heart pounding in her chest, Janine made her way up the stone path to Maureen's front door. She knocked softly at first, then more insistently, but there was no answer. She called out Maureen's name, pressing her ear against the wooden door, but the house remained eerily silent. Janine's pulse quickened. She tried the doorknob, locked. Now genuinely alarmed, Janine hurried back to her house and dialed 911, her hands shaking. "I'm really worried about my neighbor," she told the dispatcher, her voice trembling. "There's a horrible smell coming from her house and I haven't seen her in days." Within minutes, a patrol car arrived, followed by an ambulance. 2 officers, Sergeant Karen Wells and Officer David Lowell, approached Maureen's house with a crowbar in hand, prepared for the worst. They knocked once more, calling out for Maureen, but when no answer came, they forced the door open. As soon as the door swung inward, a putrid wave of decay hit them like a physical blow. The smell was unmistakable. Death had settled within the walls of the house. The officers exchanged grim glances and proceeded with caution, their hands resting on their holstered weapons as they stepped inside. The house was unsettlingly quiet, the air thick with the stench of decomposition. They moved through the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silence. It didn't take long to find her. In the master bedroom, lying on the floor between the bed and the dresser, was the body of Maureen Delacroix. Maureen's lifeless body was sprawled awkwardly, partially clothed, with multiple stab wounds marring her torso and neck. The blood had long since dried, staining the wooden floor beneath her. It was clear that this had been no accident. The scene was one of chaos and violence. A brutal murder, not the natural death the officers had secretly hoped for. Maureen's once serene bedroom was now a horrifying testament to her final moments. The dresser drawers were pulled out, clothes strewn across the room as though there had been a struggle. A chair had been knocked over, and the bedspread was crumpled in disarray, as if Maureen had tried desperately to escape her attacker. Officer Lowell stepped closer to the body, noting the stab wounds, the signs of defensive injuries on her arms. She had fought back. His face paled as he muttered, "Jesus, what happened here?" Sergeant Wells, swallowing the bile rising in her throat, radioed for backup. This was no longer a wellness check. It was a crime scene. Within the hour, the house was surrounded by yellow tape, and the once peaceful street was flooded with police cars, crime scene investigators, and curious neighbors peeking from behind their curtains. Janine, who had stayed outside, watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of dread. She saw the paramedics bring out a stretcher, though it was clear that Maureen was beyond saving. A shroud of disbelief settled over the neighborhood. Willow Glen wasn't the kind of place where things like this happened. News of Maureen's death spread quickly, and with it came an avalanche of questions. Who could have done this? What? Everyone knew Maureen as the kind, gentle widow who had lived there for years. She had no enemies, no obvious reason for anyone to want to hurt her. As the investigation kicked off, Sergeant Wells led the initial sweep of the house, searching for any clues that could explain the horrific crime. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious robbery motive. Her jewelry and valuables were untouched. Whoever had killed Maureen had been someone she trusted, someone she had let in. As night fell and the streetlights flickered on, casting eerie shadows on the crime scene, one thing became clear: this was no random act of violence. This murder was personal, and the truth behind it was going to shatter the lives of everyone involved. Unbeknownst to the officers and the neighbors watching from a distance, the dark, twisted secret between Maureen and her grandson Tobias was about to surface, setting the stage for a shocking and gruesome revelation. Maureen Delacroix had always lived a life that, on the surface, appeared simple and dignified. Born and raised in a small town just outside of Willow Glen, she was the type of person people trusted. She had been a beloved schoolteacher for over 40 years, shaping the lives of hundreds of children, imparting not only academic lessons but life wisdom. In her early years, she had been married to Charles Delacroix, a local contractor who had built half the homes in the town. Together, they had created a modest but comfortable life, though they never had children of their own. Charles had passed away 10 years ago, and though Maureen had taken the loss hard, she seemed to have found some semblance of peace in her widowhood. She threw herself into her community, volunteering at the local library, attending book clubs, and nurturing a tight-knit group of friends. The neighbors often commented on how well she maintained her home, tending to her garden and keeping everything in order as if she still had a reason to make things perfect. Despite being well-liked by everyone who knew her, Maureen was a private woman. She rarely spoke about her personal life, and even those closest to her couldn't say they truly knew what went on behind her quiet demeanor. She lived alone, a quiet existence punctuated by visits from her family, most notably her grandson, Tobias Delacroix. Tobias was the child of Charles's estranged sister, who had passed away when he was just a boy. Maureen and Charles had taken Tobias in briefly during his adolescence, though his troubled childhood meant he was often sent between relatives. After Charles's death, Tobias re-entered Maureen's life as a young adult. At the time, he had been in and out of various jobs, struggling with a lack of direction. Maureen, eager to maintain some sense of family, welcomed him back with open arms, offering him emotional and financial support. At first, the arrangement seemed normal, a grandson leaning on his grandmother in tough times. Tobias was a tall, quiet young man with dark hair and a brooding presence. He often seemed lost, like he didn't quite belong anywhere. Maureen was his anchor, providing the stability he so desperately needed. But soon, neighbors began noticing that Tobias's visits became more frequent and lasted longer. People began to wonder about the nature of their relationship, though no one dared to voice their suspicions. Despite his troubled background, Maureen doted on Tobias in ways that raised eyebrows. She bought him expensive clothes, allowed him to stay at her house for days at a time, and was often seen driving him around town. Some chalked it up to a grandmother's unconditional love for her only remaining family. Others, thought there was something unsettling about the way Tobias hovered around Maureen, his mood dark and intense. As Tobias became more dependent on Maureen, their relationship took a disturbing turn. It began with subtle signs: Tobias growing possessive of his grandmother, angered whenever she made plans that didn't involve him. Maureen, always eager to please him, started withdrawing from her social circles, cutting back on her outings with friends and becoming more reclusive. Her friends and neighbors took note but attributed it to her grief and old age. However, behind the closed doors of Maureen's pristine home, a twisted relationship was brewing. Tobias, emotionally unstable and deeply reliant on Maureen's affection, began crossing lines that no one could have imagined. Their bond, once perceived as familial, spiraled into something unnatural. The once demure widow became caught in Tobias's emotional manipulation and control, trapped in a secret that weighed heavily on her. Maureen, despite her quiet strength, was emotionally vulnerable. The loss of Charles and the isolation of widowhood had left her yearning for connection, and in Tobias, she found someone who needed her. But it was a toxic kind of need. Over time, their relationship shifted into something sinister, with Maureen unable to break free from the grasp of her own blood. Her friends, though concerned, never saw the true depth of the situation. Maureen was an expert at maintaining appearances. She continued to attend her book clubs and meetups at the library, but she no longer shared personal stories. When asked about Tobias, she would smile softly and say, "He's family. He just needs me right now." No one knew how dark things had become until it was too late. The woman who had spent her life caring for others was now caught in a web of secrecy and control, spun by the very person she had sought to protect. As the investigation into her murder began, detectives would soon uncover the shocking truth about her relationship with Tobias. A truth that would not only explain her violent end but would also expose a secret that had been festering behind closed doors for years. In death, Maureen Delacroix would finally reveal the complexity of the life she had hidden so well. The brutal discovery of Maureen Delacroix's body immediately set off a wave of panic throughout Willow Glen. A murder of this magnitude was unheard of in the peaceful neighborhood. Within hours, the quiet street was buzzing with detectives, forensic teams, and crime scene investigators trying to piece together what had happened inside the house. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Detective Ava Carmichael, a seasoned professional known for her sharp intuition and ability to uncover hidden truths. Carmichael had worked in the Major Crimes Unit for over a decade, solving some of the most complex homicides in the county. She was meticulous, driven, and never one to shy away from difficult cases. From the moment she stepped into Maureen's home, she knew this would be a case like no other. The crime scene was brutal, but what stood out to Carmichael was the lack of forced entry. Whoever had committed the murder had likely been someone Maureen knew, someone she trusted enough to let inside. This immediately narrowed down the suspect pool. Maureen's reclusive nature meant she didn't entertain many visitors, but there was one name that stood out in her sparse social circle: Tobias Delacroix, her grandson. Carmichael instructed her team to collect as much evidence as possible from the scene. The forensic team combed through the house, dusting for fingerprints, collecting blood samples, and taking photographs of the disarray. It was clear from the multiple stab wounds that this had been a crime of passion, a violent, frenzied attack rather than a calculated, premeditated one. As they examined the scene, Carmichael's partner, Detective Mason Harlan, noticed something odd in the living room. On a small side table near Maureen's favorite armchair was an overturned cup of tea, still half full. It suggested that the attack had been sudden and unexpected. Whoever had killed Maureen had caught her off guard. Carmichael ordered a search of the rest of the house and surrounding areas. Outside, in the garden, one of the forensic officers found a pair of gardening gloves, bloodied and discarded. They had likely been used by the killer to try and clean up the scene or perhaps to avoid leaving fingerprints. The gloves were bagged and sent to the lab for DNA analysis, though Carmichael had a growing suspicion that Tobias's involvement was more than just circumstantial. The next step was to interview neighbors and anyone who had been in contact with Maureen in the days leading up to her death. Janine Rue, the neighbor who had called 911, mentioned seeing Tobias at the house a few days earlier, though she hadn't thought much of it at the time. He often visited his grandmother, and while there had always been something unsettling about him, she couldn't imagine him being capable of something like this. Carmichael noted Janine's observations but needed more concrete evidence. The detectives began pulling records on Tobias. His criminal history, financial records, anything that might give them a clue about his state of mind and his relationship with Maureen. What they found was troubling. Tobias had a history of minor offenses, bar fights, public intoxication, and a couple of restraining orders from former girlfriends. There was a pattern of instability and violent outbursts. Tobias was brought in for questioning the next day. He appeared calm, even detached, as he sat across from Carmichael in the interrogation room. His demeanor was unsettling. There was no visible grief, no sorrow for the woman who had raised him. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of Maureen's murder, he claimed to have been at a friend's house. But as Carmichael pressed further, his story began to unravel. He was lying, Carmichael would later say, reflecting on that first interrogation. It was all in his body language, his eyes darting, the way he avoided direct answers. He was hiding something. With Tobias under suspicion, the detectives intensified their efforts to find evidence linking him to the crime. They analyzed phone records, spoke to his so-called alibi, and reviewed the security footage from the area around Maureen's home. All signs pointed to Tobias, but they needed something definitive to tie him to the murder. It wasn't until the forensics team returned with DNA results from the bloodied gloves found in the garden that they had their breakthrough. The DNA was a match to Tobias, placing him at the scene. Carmichael knew they had their man. The only question left was why. Why had Tobias, Maureen's own grandson, committed such a heinous act? As Carmichael prepared for the next stage of the investigation, she knew this case was about more than just murder. It was about twisted relationships, hidden secrets, and the darkness that sometimes lurks within even the closest of families. The forensic analysis of the crime scene at Maureen Delacroix's home quickly became the linchpin of the investigation. The bloodied gardening gloves recovered from the garden had already provided crucial evidence, linking Tobias Delacroix directly to the crime. However, Detective Ava Carmichael knew that for the prosecution to build an airtight case, they would need more than just the DNA match. They needed to understand the full picture of how and why this brutal murder had unfolded. The autopsy of Maureen's body revealed disturbing details. The coroner confirmed that she had been stabbed multiple times, with the fatal wound being a deep slash across her throat. What was particularly telling, though, was the nature of the injuries. There were defensive wounds on Maureen's hands and arms, indicating that she had fought back against her attacker. This wasn't a quick or calculated murder. It had been violent, impulsive, and full of rage. The crime scene analysis also revealed more about the nature of the attack. Blood spatter patterns suggested that the altercation had started in the living room, where Maureen had likely been sitting with Tobias, before escalating into the hallway and ending near the kitchen. This movement through the house indicated that Maureen had tried to flee, desperately trying to escape her attacker before succumbing to her injuries. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence came from Maureen's bedroom. There, the forensic team uncovered traces of Tobias's fingerprints and DNA on various personal items, including her jewelry box and her bedside table. This raised questions about what Tobias had been doing in such intimate spaces and why his presence extended beyond the usual areas he would have been in during his visits. But the most damning discovery was a small vial of sedatives found in the kitchen, hidden in a cupboard behind cans of food. Upon testing, traces of the drug were found in Maureen's bloodstream, though not in a lethal amount. This suggested that Tobias had likely drugged his grandmother in an attempt to subdue her, but when it hadn't worked, the situation had escalated into violence. This evidence painted a chilling picture. Tobias had likely planned to incapacitate Maureen with the sedatives, perhaps to rob her or manipulate her in some way, but when the drugs didn't take full effect, he lost control. The murder, it seemed, had not been premeditated but had resulted from a moment of overwhelming fury and panic. The forensic team also examined Tobias's phone records, which revealed a series of text messages between him and an unknown contact. The messages hinted at financial troubles, with Tobias expressing frustration over money and his dependence on Maureen. There were also unsettling messages that hinted at a deeper emotional entanglement between the two, references to his obsession with her and hints at their twisted relationship. Carmichael knew they had enough to move forward with the case. The evidence was overwhelming, pointing to a tragic blend of emotional instability, financial desperation, and a relationship that had crossed boundaries in ways no one could have imagined. The investigation had now laid bare the dark secrets that had simmered beneath the surface of Maureen and Tobias's relationship, a mix of love, control, and violence that had culminated in a gruesome murder. The investigation took a pivotal turn when Detective Ava Carmichael uncovered a critical piece of evidence that would shift the entire trajectory of the case. Among the items found in Tobias Delacroix's possession was Maureen's old journal, an unassuming leather-bound book that initially seemed like just another memento of a grandmother's life. However, as Carmichael leafed through its pages, she realized this was no ordinary diary. The entries were recent, written in the months leading up to Maureen's death, and they chronicled her increasingly complicated relationship with Tobias. At first, the entries were simple reflections of her love for her grandson, her hopes to see him succeed in life, and her worries about his troubled past. But as time went on, the tone of the journal shifted. Maureen began documenting strange behavior from Tobias. His possessiveness, his frequent mood swings, and his increasingly erratic demands for money. One entry stood out in particular: "I don't know how things have gotten so out of hand. Tobias is not the boy I raised. He has become someone else, someone I don't recognize. I feel like I'm losing control, like I'm trapped in a situation I can't escape." This journal entry, along with others, hinted at an underlying manipulation, control, and possibly even emotional abuse on Tobias's part. It also revealed that Maureen had been thinking of cutting off Tobias financially, feeling she could no longer handle his constant demands. This revelation provided the motive that detectives had been searching for. Tobias, desperate for control and money, might have lashed out when he realized Maureen intended to sever their toxic relationship. The journal was the smoking gun, a window into Maureen's private thoughts and fears in the days leading up to her murder. Combined with the forensic evidence, it painted a damning picture of Tobias's escalating instability and the dark, twisted relationship that had ended in a gruesome act of violence. With this crucial lead, Detective Carmichael knew they had the final piece needed to bring Tobias to justice. It was only a matter of time before the full truth would be revealed in court. With the overwhelming evidence gathered from the crime scene, forensic analysis, and Maureen Delacroix's journal, Detective Ava Carmichael was confident that Tobias Delacroix had nowhere left to hide. Armed with a warrant, the police swiftly arrested Tobias at his apartment, where he appeared calm and eerily detached, showing little emotion even as the cuffs were placed on his wrists. As the case moved to trial, the courtroom was packed with media, curious locals, and Maureen's few remaining family members. The prosecution laid out a meticulous case against Tobias. They argued that his emotional instability, financial dependence on his grandmother, and increasing desperation had driven him to murder Maureen when she threatened to cut him off. The prosecution highlighted the evidence: the DNA on the gardening gloves, the traces of sedatives in Maureen's bloodstream, and the damning entries from her journal that revealed her fear of her grandson. Tobias's defense attorney tried to argue that Tobias's mental state was compromised, claiming that he was suffering from severe psychological trauma stemming from his troubled upbringing and his reliance on Maureen for emotional and financial support. Morton painted Tobias as a man trapped in a complex, unhealthy relationship, arguing that the murder had been the result of a sudden break in his mental state rather than premeditation. But the evidence was too strong. The jury couldn't overlook the clear signs of manipulation, violence, and the deliberate nature of the attack. Tobias's calm demeanor throughout the trial only reinforced the idea that he felt no remorse for his actions, further damning him in the eyes of the court. After just 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Tobias was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Delacroix family, shattered by the loss of Maureen and the horrifying truth of Tobias's actions, struggled to reconcile with the aftermath. For the community, the trial brought closure to a case that had shocked everyone, but it also left behind a haunting reminder of how twisted and dangerous love can become when it crosses lines that should never be broken. The guilty verdict brought a sense of closure to the case, but the impact of Maureen Delacroix's gruesome murder would linger long after the trial. The community of Willow Glen, once peaceful and trusting, was left shaken by the dark secrets revealed during the investigation. Neighbors who had known Maureen for years struggled to comprehend how such a tragic end could come from within her own family. Tobias Delacroix was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his once promising future now lost in the shadow of his crime. In prison, he remained cold and emotionless, refusing to speak about the murder or his twisted relationship with Maureen. For Detective Ava Carmichael, the case was one of the most disturbing she had ever worked on. The journal entries and the forensic evidence had laid bare the emotional manipulation and toxic control Tobias had exerted over his grandmother, turning a once loving bond into something deadly. Maureen's remaining family members, few as they were, struggled with the dual loss of both her and Tobias. The tragedy left behind a community forever scarred, a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist even within family ties.